56. So we're moving right along. And this one here is another Psalm of David. It has an interesting title, For the Choir Director according to Jonath rehokim. Okay, which sounds like a really strange title, but it is a strange title until you look at the meaning of it. Okay, and it's a mechatim of David, which is a word that nobody knows what the meaning is. So I'm not going to try to define it. There's a whole bunch of guesses out there, but nobody really knows what the meaning of that word is. So we're just going to leave it at that. And then it continues on, when the Philistines seized him in Gath. Now, we looked at that a few Psalms back of where David was running from Saul and he went into Gath to hide. And we're going to look at kind of what that, let's say, the backstory is. But first of all, let's look at something I found interesting when you see the history of David at this time in his life, and then you look at this psalm that he wrote, and it's like it doesn't really make sense. It's like, David, did not you understand the fact that you can't be doing all this stupid stuff and then come to God and ask for protection? And I find it interesting from the standpoint of, we are guilty of the same thing sometimes. We're guilty of this concept of, okay, I've been living this way, I've been doing this certain thing, and I continue, and eventually, I say I'm going to get to the point to where, I really don't have a right to go before God, okay, because I'm messing up. I know I'm messing up. I know I'm the problem, but I continue to do it. And so I'm going to stop going before the throne because God has no reason to listen to me anymore, because every time I go before him and I say I'm going to stop doing this or I'm start doing that, and then as time goes on, I never really do it anyway, so I just got to quit this. And that can easily become a trap we can fall into. David helps us to see how to get out of that trap. And that's what this psalm is about. The psalm is about how to get out of that trap of where we are the screw up and God still loves us. His love doesn't change. So what we're afraid of, we're afraid of so many things. We're afraid of this world is changing, and we look at the politics that are going on, and we look at all the evil that's going on, and what it means for our offspring. For most of us, we figure we'll probably be dead before it gets any more changes in this world. That's the advantage of being old. Okay, when you're old, you don't have a whole lot more years left here, and so probably get out of here before it gets really bad. But then we start thinking, well, I've got kids, I've got grandkids, maybe even great-grandkids. What's their life going to be? And we think this moral decline that has been taking place in this country and around the world. It's astonishing what is acceptable, what is okay. And we think, what impact is that going to have? And then on top of that, well, one of the things about getting older is things change physically. I no longer am physically who I used to be, and there's a lot of things I no longer can do, and I've got probably far more health issues than I ever even thought of before, so at least I got something to worry about with myself. Well, why are we worrying? This Jonath rehokim, literal translation, is on the silent dove far off. That's the literal translation, because Jonathan means dove, elem, silence or dumbness, and dumbness not in our mind, automatically goes to stupid, no, dumbness and not being able to speak, okay? And then rehokim, distance or remote. I have a Bible that supposedly is what is known as a literal translation. It doesn't try to reformulate everything. It just takes it as it says and puts it into English. And that's where the silent dove far off is a literal translation. And David as the uncomplaining sufferer among strangers. So let's go back and let's take a quick glance. We're going to quickly glance at David's situation at the time and found in 1 Samuel 21, and just a few verses there. When David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Encash, king of Gath, but the servants of Encash said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? David took these words to heart and was greatly feared, Ashken, king of Gath." David had messed up. Okay, he's running from Saul. That was no fault of his own. He goes to Gath, and we remember where his former adversary came from, this big tall guy called Goliath. He was from Gath, okay, which is kind of interesting that David decides to go hide there. So you might say he's running from Saul. He goes to the enemy, hoping that the enemy will let him hide there. And of course, they don't really like him because they are an enemy, because they killed their champion. So he's not really making smart moves. And before this, he had stopped at the priest, and he had lied to them so he could get some bread to eat and to get the sword. And the whole series of events that led him up to this place was not wise decisions or godly things going on. And then you look at this psalm and you say, how can you have done all of these things? How can you lived and acted in this way, and then you go out and you start off a psalm that says, be gracious to me? Be gracious to me. Do we go before God after we have gone through this whole series of stupidity, messing up, and doing one dumb thing after another, knowing that I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't go there. And then we go to God in prayer and say, oh God, be gracious to me. Man has trampled upon me. Like, I didn't do nothing wrong, God. That's not what David is saying. David is saying, I know that the loving kindness of my God is so great that even in the midst of my stupidity, even in the midst of my sinfulness, you still love me. You know, wow, that's a whole different aspect now. Fighting all day long, he oppresses me. My foes have trampled upon me all day long, for they are many who will fight proudly against me. The enemies of David are real. Some of them he has created his own, but mostly it really isn't that he created them. They are just enemies. They are people that hate him for one reason or another. He's got King Saul and his army after him, and David had done nothing to deserve that. He goes and hides in Gath. Well, that's a little different story, but these Philistines, they've been enemies of the Israelites for a long time. So it's kind of like, I'm going to go hide in the midst of the enemy's camp. Not wise choice. Verses 3 and 4, when I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. David is terrified, and for good reason. He has two nations out to kill him. We don't really think of it that way, but that's really what's going on. There are actually two nations that are well-armed, and their desire is to kill him. So he says, when I am afraid. In other words, David is saying, even though I caused a lot of this problem myself, I still am afraid. I am. Fear is not sin. Fear is a good thing sometimes. But then he goes on, I will put my trust in you. See, David understood who his God is. Do we understand who our God is? Do we have the same thing where we can say to our God that even though I've done all this dumb stuff, even though I've messed up at all these places, I know you are a loving God. Verse 4, in God whose word I praise, in God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can mere man do to me? Now, interesting things here. God in whose word I praise. The word of God is the truth of God. Okay, so David is saying, I trust and I praise my God because he's true. I put my trust in you. I am afraid. It's a natural outcome of what's going on around me. But when I put my trust in you, when I just totally set aside my fears, then you will protect me. And I really don't have a legitimate reason anymore to be afraid. His persecution is real. But what about us? Is our persecution real? Or are we even persecuted? We really don't think of ourselves as being persecuted. And to a large extent, we're not. There are many persecutions that have gone out throughout all of history for Christians that were far greater than anything anybody here has experienced and probably will. But there's unknowns in the future. There's things that have happened in this country that you could call persecutions, at least for the ones that it impacted. Remember a guy who was a baker named Jack Phillips? Okay, you remember it took him over 10 years to get things fixed. So it wasn't like they came in, created a problem for him, a few days later he went to court and everything was settled. No, it was over 10 years. Miss Stedman, with the florist, was forced to retire, had to close her business. Coach Joe Kennedy, it took him 7 years to get things rectified. So it wasn't like these things just happened overnight. But these are such tiny little things in reality of what many of our forefathers have gone through. Now stop, and I'm going to read this section of Hebrews. And as I read this, stop and think about how you would react if this happened to you. How would I react if this happened to me? But remember the former days when after being enlightened, or we would say converted, you endured a great conflict of suffering, partly by being made public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly becoming reproaches and tribulations and partly shares with those who were also treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Now, in the middle of that, the one thing that kind of should have jumped out at you, the seizure of property. How would you react if the government came along and because of changes in the laws took your property and said, you get out, it's now ours, and you get nothing? This is what happened to the early Christians. They would literally have their property seized by the government and they were thrown out. And here in Hebrews, the writer is saying, you gladly accepted that. Would we gladly accept that? It might be difficult to gladly accept that. But if we understood the rest of this passage, it says, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. The promise that we have is so much greater than any loss we could take. And this is why we go back to that passage where it said, what can mere man do to you? You see, if mankind is incapable of taking away from you anything of value, and the only thing you have of value is your soul, mankind cannot take that. Nothing else really has value in comparison to that. So once we understand that, once we realize that the value that we have is in our soul, then there is nothing that mankind can do to us. They can take away our house. They can take away our land. They can throw us in prison. They can even kill us. But they still can't attack our soul. Verse 5 through 7, all day long they distort my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They attack, they lurk, they watch my steps. And as they're waiting to take my life, because of wickedness, cast them forth. In anger, put down the peoples, O God. David is saying here, they distort my words. This has been done to God's people for a long, long time. Even when Jesus was walking on earth, he would say something and they would come along and distort his words. It was done. It's still done, and it's going to continue being done. Their thoughts are against me for evil. All that these people want to do to David is evil. They attack, they lurk, they watch my steps. Now, one part that says there, they watch my steps, is something we got to remember, because the world is watching our steps. The world is paying attention to what we do, what we say, how we act, how we live. All of these things are being watched. And they're just waiting. You say you're a Christian, and yet look at what you did. You say you're a Christian, look at how you live. You say that you're a Christian, and you act that way. They might not say it to your face. And then again, they may. The reality of it is, they're watching. I assure you they're watching. Because of wickedness, cast them forth. David is now going to God and saying, because of their wickedness, cast them forth. Or, think of it this way. They think that there are no consequences to opposing God. And this is what the world has. They continue in their sinful ways, their sinful actions, and they feel as though there really is no consequences to this. I can do what I want. I can live as I want. I can act like I want. I don't need no God in my life telling me what to do. And everything will be just fine, because when this life is over, I'm dead or whatever. But they're living in a world mindset which says there are no consequences to what I'm doing. Verse 8, you have taken account of my wanderings. Now here's where David is at least hinting back toward the fact that not everything he did was good. Because his wanderings from God. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Okay, now put my tears in a bottle. That's kind of there's a bunch of different interpretations for that, and it's used in a bunch of different ways. But I think that really what he's saying here is, through my sorrow and my anguish, I am crying. And I want you to understand this cry. And I want you to hold on to this. I want you to count it up like you're taking care of me, like you care about me, that every teardrop that drops from my eyelids is something that you care about, because you are who you are. Because I need to know that you're recording every one of my sufferings. And David says, are they not in your book? David is saying, I know you keep track of everything that is going on. I know that even when you take into account my wanderings, even when you're paying attention to the fact that I wander away from you, you still are even counting my tears. And you even are recording them in the book. Now, in New Testament, we have a little illustration of that in Matthew 10, verses 30, 31. But the very hairs of your head are numbered. So do not fear. You are of more value than many sparrows. Now, of course, before I was talking about the sparrows, God knows the sparrows. The fact that God is saying here in Matthew that he's saying the fact that every aspect of who you are, God cares about. David is saying the same thing. Every aspect of who I am, every part of me, you care about. Verses 9 through 11, then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God whose word I praise. In the Lord whose word I praise. In God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? We've heard that line before. When my enemies will turn back. This I know because God is with me. God is for me. The God whose word I praise. The truth of my God I will continue to praise. Even though I messed up, even though I did things wrong, I'm still going to come back and I'm going to praise you because you didn't change, I did. Whose word I praise. Here again, the word is the truth. I praise the truth. In God I have put my trust. That truth of God, that word of God, that power of God, that loving kindness of God, this is where my trust is. So that I can just say it again. What can man do to me? If all my trust is in my God, there is nothing anybody can do to me that's outside of your control, my God. It can't happen. Now here's verse 12. I actually had to use a different version. I've got both of them up there because in ours, the one we use, the New Revised Standard Version, it's very confusing. Because it reads, your vows are binding upon me, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. Now, your vows, it sounds like God's vows. And that just seemed like that was a little strange. So if you go to the ESV, it reads, I must perform my vows to you, O God. It kind of really clears it up. It's the same verse. It's just the different translations. One makes it clear, one isn't as clear. So it is, God, I make promises to you, and I know that I have in the past, and I know that I have messed them up, and I know that you still love me, and you still care for me, but I'm going to do it again. I'm going to say, I promise you this. I'm going to make vows to you. And I really, truly, honestly am going to try to fulfill them. Not because I'm afraid you're going to leave me, because I know you won't. But I'm going to fulfill them because of who you are. Because I will render thank offerings to you. In other words, I'm going to thank you because I can look back at all the things that you have done, all the wonderful things that you have done, even though I deserve none of it, even though I have messed up over and over again. Yet I'm going to thank you. I'm going to praise you. Verse 13. For you have delivered my soul from death, indeed my feet from stumbling, so that I may walk before God in the light of the living. That's an interesting ending. For you have delivered my soul from death. Because I put my trust in you, and my trust is not in my doing for you, not my doing to you, not my doing. It's all you. It's all one-sided. Because you delivered me from death. I didn't do anything to deserve it. I didn't do anything to earn this. Indeed, my feet from stumbling. As a matter of fact, even though I don't even recognize it sometimes, as I'm going through life, you put up roadblocks, or you held me up, or you did this for me, you did that for me, and I really didn't even notice it until I look back and say, that was close. I could have easily fallen into that trap. I could have easily had this happen to me. But I'm looking back at it and saying, wow, you kept me. You held me back. Your arms, your hands, your power saved me. You delivered my soul from death. And here, the only thing that we have that the man cannot get a hold of is our soul. But God can. And he has delivered my soul from death. Why? Here's the so I may walk before God in the light of the living. Now, that seems almost like the wrong word was put there because we're used to reading something a certain way. It should say, in the land of the living. That fits with our mindset when we're thinking, when we're reading something. Only it's not what it says. It says, in the light of the living. The light is the light of Christ. The light is the true path, the true way of the living. Who are the living? The ones whose souls have been redeemed from death. These are the ones who are walking before God in the light of the living. The light that sees, the light that knows, the light that understands, the living, those that are truly alive in Christ. David recognized this fact. David recognized the fact that no matter what he had done, no matter how he had acted, no matter what the scenarios in life, that he had a God whose loving kindness endures forever. He doesn't change. He doesn't love us more or less because we're good or bad. He loves us the same regardless. Now, he might straighten us out once in a while, but in the same way that a father disciplines a child, is that they discipline them because they're mad at him? Well, they shouldn't. Generally, if they're a proper parent, they're disciplining them because they love them. They care about them. And discipline is necessary in order to prevent them from hurting themselves or others. God does the same thing with us. He will discipline us. But it's not disciplining out of anger. His discipline is always out of love and compassion. And that's why we can walk before God in the light of the living.